All right, so some housekeeping stuff before we get going. I realized the module 13 reading, I'm gonna have to go in and manually sync it, so that should be get done as soon as we're done with class here. But that was the last module reading, so one thing I'll also do this afternoon is update scores. I'll get those downloaded quickly so I can drop your lowest, so you can kind of see what your grade is with that lowest module reading drop. We only have one more quiz, which will be due next Monday, right? The module 13 quiz. Once that passes, I'll do a similar thing on Canvas where I drop the two lowest, so you'll see what your current quiz grade would be with the two lowest drop. And then after Thursday's class, it'll be the last class I get in-class credit for. So after Thursday's class, I'll also get Canvas updated to drop your 4 lowest in-class quizzes. Going into next week, you should have an idea about what your grade will be in every single category. The only thing that you have left then is the final. Okay? With one exception, which is the 5th and final pack back, which I now have kind of set to be published. In fact, I think I had a thing here. I had it set to both. I'm going to update it here in class just to make sure everyone can see it. I just didn't want it to pop up there and have anyone question it before class. So what? 9:30 should be okay. All right. So now that 5th and final pack back should be available. All it's kind of getting at is really what we're talking about this week. So it's asking you about market for higher education. So I'm trying to get you to think about a little bit more than we've talked about in class. A lot of times I mention products. When you think about supply, demand, I don't know. I mentioned gasoline, bottles of water, things like that. But everything's a market, right? So the example I gave you is the market for higher education, right? So we'll talk this week about monopolies and competitive markets. That's likely what the higher education market is going to look like. So today we'll talk a lot about product differentiation. I'll kind of mention this a little bit in the lecture. But I've got a bunch of different questions and kind of thoughts that relate that market for higher education to what we'll talk about this week. But anything's fair game. At the very end of it, I kind of also say, well, what do you think about in terms of the market for higher education and externalities? What might the government do to kind of push us towards a socially efficient quantity? So really anything we've talked about in this class, you can relate to that market for higher education is really fair game for your posts. Okay. So one last pack back. You need to think about markets that don't look traditional. The market for higher education being the one that I singled out. That'll be, I think I've got that set to be due, at the end of next, where is it at? Tuesday, right? So just got about a week to do that. It's gonna be a little bit quicker, but I'd like to get that. I set that due date to be a little bit quick so I can get your grades updated after Tuesday. And that way, everything after next Tuesday should be up to date, ready to go. You'll know exactly where you're going at into that final, or where you're currently at going into that final. Okay. So last pack back assignment due next Tuesday. Last quiz, which is going to be pop up after class Thursday, due at the end of the day, Monday. Last in-class quiz, we'll use one today and then Thursday. Other than that, that's it. Okay. And then we just got the final exam. All right. So you'll see a lot of changes being made to the Canvas. It should give you a slightly more accurate idea of kind of exactly where you're standing with those lowest getting dropped. Now, as always, I try to kind of pull this up after the last exam. If you just people are telling me you can't use this, you can't use it on Canvas. It's a file that you've got to download, right? So once you download the file, then you can actually make updates to these values, kind of put in your grades in these different categories. Now, I said if you are interested in what does your grade look like with the lowest drop, you can start to kind of enter them in here. So obviously, like this was just at the end of the last exam. I'll update it this afternoon to kind of put those categories in, so it'll be kind of currently up to date. So you can throw in, what we've done since that second exam, more of your quiz grades, in-class quiz grades, so that it will show you what things will look like once those lowest get dropped down here in this category. But I'll also then, after everything gets updated next week, kind of show you once again how to use this tool, where you don't have to worry about the lowest getting dropped because I would have already done that. All right, so right now, this is just kind of our hypothetical grade tool. And And if you have any questions, some people have reached out. I can also kind of do some of this for you or kind of help you with this in office hours if you stop by. Okay. All right. Other than that, I will get an announcement posted. And I think this helps just with like the last quiz. I am going to have to change my office hours tomorrow to Friday again. All right. So at the end of the semester, I apologize. I make my office hours, like make my own schedule. And then at the end of the semester, like everybody else's scheduled, not you guys, but like other things I have to do. Those schedules get crazy because everyone's like, oh, we got to get everything done before the end of the semester. So usually, my office hours work. This is something I couldn't avoid where I have some conflicts Wednesday. So I'm going to move them to Friday. I'm tentatively thinking probably like 10 to 1, have a 3-hour time block there. I'll get the exact hours posted up in an announcement later today. I just don't want to give a definitive before I make sure that those hours will work. But that's around what they should be. And I had a lot of people kind of stop by the last time I changed to Friday more than usually on Wednesday. So I think hopefully maybe that works for you guys a little bit more. I know little fives this week and everything, but exams are coming up. We got to do what we got to do. Okay. So look for that announcement for the change of office hours, and we're getting close to that final. So you've got about 2 weeks. I posted these yesterday, actually, trying to stealthily. When you got a practice final with an answer key up there, you can start to kind of go through. These will be the questions that we primarily work through. I mean, I'll ask you guys for questions in class this week. It can be anything from old quizzes, practice problems, or these practice exam. But Tuesday and Thursday class next week are just going to be review, me answering your guys' questions. Even if it's questions that I didn't give you, like, well, what if you did this? What if you changed this? We can work through this. Those next week's classes are entirely, I mean, every class is for you, but next week classes are like dictated more by you and the questions that I get, right? And in terms of those class periods, I'll also say, just to like put it in an economic context, if I had to place the highest marginal utility or marginal benefit in class, it would be those 2 class periods. The final is the thing that's weighted the most. We're going to be reviewing questions. I made this for a reason. I made it and then wrote the exam. So I know that these questions will be helpful with the exam questions. So I would highly encourage you to be in class next Tuesday and Thursday and ask all the questions that you have, right? Yeah. Okay. Other than that, any other questions for me with housekeeping stuff before we jump into material here today? I know as we get closer, please refrain from the emails quite yet. I don't know where we're going to be yet for our team. I wish I did. This is something that I don't get to choose. So I gave my preferences and I'm still waiting to hear back. I'm hoping I hear back this week. It may not be next week, but there's only so many big rooms on campus. I requested this room. I doubt we're going to get it just because I'm low seniority. I've only been here for like, it's my 2nd year. So my requests probably don't mean as much as other people teaching B251 who've been here for 20 years, right? So it will be the day, Monday, and time slot. I believe it's 5:20 to 7:20. That's in the syllabus, but I don't know the room location yet. I will let you know as soon as I do. Okay. All right. So that puts us, I think, everything that I wanted to mention before we kind of actually look at material here. Okay. So let me silence this. All right. So we're going to do something that the other sections don't. So I teach this class a little bit different than the other ones. But I think hopefully you'll see like we're really reusing topics. So this last module shouldn't be as bad, I think, because we're using a lot of stuff we've already talked about. So I'll trip over this word a lot, but we're going to talk this week not about perfectly competitive markets, not about monopoly markets, which were our 2 extremes, but everything in the middle. So we've got a monopoly market, one firm sells everything, perfectly competitive, many firms, nobody has any control over the price. The real world, everything is not one of those, it's somewhere in the middle. So we've touched on this a little bit with like oligopoly models and game theory, but this is probably going to be a higher percentage of the markets that we see in the real world are going to be monopolistically competitive. Okay, so these monopolistic competitive markets are somewhere in the middle of this extreme of a monopoly and a perfectly competitive market. So we're going to do a lot of comparisons to those two types of markets today and rehashing a lot of things that we've talked about already. Okay. So some of the characteristics are going to look similar to a perfectly competitive market. Then we have many buyers and sellers, right? So we're going to have many firms, many buyers. We're going to have free entry and exit, so no barriers to entry. So this already starts to look like a perfectly competitive market. The key difference is we're going to have not a homogeneous or identical product in these monopolistically competitive markets, but a differentiated product. So some examples that I'll give you this. So I think about like, to me, like fast food and hamburgers, like are all the same. But what do they try to convince you? McDonald's tries to convince you that their hamburger is a little bit different than 100% grass fed. They can't claim that, but what they claim certain things to say like theirs is different than Burger King's and different than Wendy's. What does Wendy's do? They make theirs a square to make it different, right? They know it's pretty much the same product, right? But they try to create some product differentiation, either with like different attributes of that product, or even just convince you with advertising, right? So the other one I always use like clothing. Everyone's wearing clothing here today, right? They're all substitutes, right? You're all wearing a shirt. You could wear a different shirt. Those shirts are not homogeneous products, right? They're different brands. People might value higher or lower, so they might pay a higher or lower price for. They might fit better or worse, pay higher for a better fit versus not. Different quality, different colors, right? There's all these different characteristics that, yes, they're all shirts, but they're not the same product, right? But they're all part of the same market, right? There's some overall demand for clothing that each one of those companies is going to like only be able to get a part of. So what are they going to try to do? Things like apartment complexes, they try to get a larger portion of the overall demand curve, right? What do they try to convince you of? I know we're a little bit past the time. Well, if you haven't found a place to live for next year, and you're planning to be here, yikes. You're a little bit behind the 8 ball. Things move, at least from my memory, things moved like in the previous semester, you should have been looking at stuff, right? So what do these apartment complexes try to do? They try to convince you that they're unlike any other apartment complex in Bloomington, right? They've got a pool, right? They've got some cool, I don't know, common room. Everyone doesn't have to have a shared bathroom, right? In their location. So they try to create these amenities that differentiate their product. There's some overall demand for apartments in Bloomington, right? They want to try to get a larger portion of it. I'll use another example. I mentioned kind of with that pack assignment, higher education. Every college degree, even if it's kind of on the same rung of quality, isn't the same, right? So even within a state like Purdue and IU, right? They're two large state schools. They're fighting for the same in-state students, right? A lot of people apply to both. I know we might have an allegiance to one or the other. We hate each other, whatever it is, but right, there is some overall demand that they're splitting. So what do? They differentiate their product, right? IU has a law school, an architecture program. Purdue has engineering, has a big nursing program. But they try to specialize so that they can kind of create a different product and grab a different portion of the overall demand for higher education. So these are the types of markets, like almost everything you can think about at the end of the day probably is more like a monopolistically competitive market, right? There's some things that get closer to a monopoly or oligopoly market, but most things there's some product differentiation, right? Even bottled water, something that should be a perfectly competitive market. A bottle of water is a bottle of water. It's just a homogeneous product, right? You should have no influence over the price. You go to a store right now, there are different brands of water and they are different prices. Why? Because I don't know, some people think Fiji water tastes way different than Aquafina or whatever. It's all this shit, right? They're just convincing you with advertising and branding. We'll talk a little more about that next time. I shouldn't be that. I shouldn't do that, but right, like it is the same thing, right? If you look at things, it's water, right? So why are they trying to? Basically, they don't want to be in a perfectly competitive market. They want their product to be monopolistic competitive, and we'll see why here in a second. So kind of the mashup of the two markets we've already talked about is the one that we'll look at today, right? Many sellers, free entry and exit, but we've got a different product, right? Differentiated product, unlike a perfectly competitive market, which is going to move us closer to that monopoly outcome, right? So what are some characteristics? And we'll kind of look at some visuals here. A monopolistic competitive market, when we start drawing things out, it's going to look almost no different than a monopoly. We're going to identify some key differences, but on its face, just drawn on its own, it looks very similar to a monopoly market. It doesn't face a horizontal demand curve like a perfectly competitive market. It faces a slightly downward sloping demand curve. It sets the optimal profit maximizing quantity, just like every other firm we've talked about, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Now, because it does have some market power, its marginal revenue curve is going to be, just like a monopolist, twice as steep as demand. And then we're eventually going to talk about something that I didn't bring up with monopoly markets, although we could look at it with monopoly markets, which is this idea of the markup, that they're going to have a price that's set above their marginal cost. Okay? So we'll look at all these things here in just a second, but just to kind of start to think about the differences between these markets, the demand that a firm faced in a perfectly competitive market, we said was horizontal, right? It's whatever that equilibrium price was, because as soon as I charge something different than the equilibrium price, what does my quantity demanded go to? Zero, right? Can't sell it, right? So we had this horizontal demand curve where the price was their marginal revenue. A monopolist faced the entirety of market demand. So the market demand curve, even in a perfectly competitive world, market demand, the sum of every firm's demand curve, will still be downward sloping, right? That's how we kind of identified what that equilibrium price was that then created the demand for each firm. So a monopolist faces the entire demand curve. And here, I'm not going to make you compare monopolist competitive markets to price discriminating monopolists. I'll only ever kind of compare single price and price discriminating monopolists. We could start to have price discrimination in monopolist and competitive markets, but it gets a lot more complicated, so we're not going to do that. So we're here just thinking about a single price monopolist. If we have a single price monopolist, they kind of show you the math, and kind of we were using the idea that, okay, the marginal revenue curve will be twice as steep as another demand. Now, a monopolistically competitive firm, we said one of the key features of these markets was that there were still many firms. So they're not going to face the entirety of demand. They're only going to face a smaller portion of it. So the demand curve they face won't be all of market demand. It's going to be something that's a little bit lower, right? Only a portion of the overall demand. If we also have many sellers, we have many substitutes for things like clothing or higher education. What's also true? The more substitutes we have, what happens to the elasticity of demand? So if there's more options, are you going to be more or less responsive to increases in price? More. So if demand is more elastic, is it flatter or steeper? So if it's steeper, that means that you could charge any price and they keep buying the same amount. That's actually being perfectly inelastic. You're not responding at all. So being more elastic would mean the demand curve is actually a little bit flat. So these monopolistically competitive markets, they're going to face a smaller portion of demand, right? The intercept is going to be lower, and it's also going to be flat, right? Because there's now more substitutes, right? They're not perfect substitutes, but they actually exist, right? There's some that exist. Okay. All right. So I think I left this slide open because I wanted to start to make these comparisons. Okay. Also, I know this is like, I don't know, this is a lot today. I don't even have the light on. I don't know what feature was changed. I played around with it before my last class and I couldn't figure it out. So if you need any clarifying on this, let me know. But I think it actually maybe makes it show up better. I don't know, it gets a little bit washed out over here. So I'll try to make sure I keep it over here. All right. So if I have a monopoly market, so let's just start out thinking about, here's the firm's marginal cost. Okay. If I've got a monopoly market, they're going to face the entire demand curve and a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Okay. How would the monopolist identify the profit maximizing quantity? Well, it's going to be where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. How do they find the price? They go up to the only other thing I have drawn in here, they're going to go up to the demand curve, right? So here's kind of my monopoly setting. If I've got a monopolistically competitive firm, they're only going to get a portion of overall demand. So their demand curve they face is going to be much smaller, right? Instead of one firm, we now have many. So we take market demand and we might split it up amongst 20 firms. Okay? So their demand curve is not only going to be lower, it's also going to be flatter. We said more elastic. So here's the demand curve for that monopolistically competitive market, or sorry, monopolistically competitive firm, a firm in a monopolistically competitive market. Now, they're still going to face a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, and they're going to identify the profit maximizing quantity exactly like a monopolist was. Where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? And then they're going to set this price up on their demand curve. Okay. Now, here we're making a firm to firm comparison. So initially it might look like, well, the monopolistically competitive market actually ends up at a lower quantity. But we're not looking at the markets here. We're only looking at one firm. So to get market quantity, what would I actually need to do? Take the quantity each firm is selling and then add it up across all firms. So if we're just looking at the firm level, yes, a monopolistically competitive firm will choose a lower quantity than a monopoly. But a monopolistically competitive market, if we have more firms, more competition, what do you think is going to happen to the quantity that we see in a monopolistically competitive market relative to a monopoly? It's actually going to be higher, right? We're getting closer to that allocated efficient point, that perfectly competitive point. That quantity we know is kind of going to be higher than that of the monopoly. But here, this is just the firm level. So if you're thinking about, we're making firm comparisons here. Okay. Now, everybody with me up to this point, sorry. So notice the quantity at the firm level is going to be lower, and the price that we see in these markets is also going to be lower. So just a little bit of a foreshadow, we won't talk too much about today. Who do you think, so relative to a single price monopolist, if the market has some competition, it's monopolistically competitive, the price is going to be lower. Who do you think is going to benefit from that? What surplus is going to go up? Consumers. What surplus is likely to go down? Producers. Now, if we're having more competition, what else do you think is probably going down? Another thing we talked about was surplus, not producer or consumer surplus. But if I'm going from the monopoly outcome closer to the perfectly competitive outcome, what's getting smaller? Deadweight loss, right? We're getting closer to that point where deadweight loss would be 0 in a perfectly competitive market. So the only other thing I wanted to mention here, as long as we're here, that we didn't really look at with monopolists, but we could have. So if I look here, and I tried to draw this to scale, I'm going to identify the marginal cost in both these markets. So you kind of notice, if I'm thinking about the markup here of a monopolist, that's just the difference between the price and the marginal cost of the monopolist at that profit maximizing quantity. So markup of a monopolistically competitive market, here I guess I could monopolistically competitive, because I know we've got multiple MCs here, monopolistic competitive and marginal cost. But the markup there is going to be the difference between the price and the marginal cost for the monopolistically competitive market. Which of these markups looks to be smaller here? The monopolistically competitive market, like I said, I try to draw it to scale. It's smaller, right? How much I can have that price set above my marginal cost, that is going to give you a larger gap when I have more market power. We'll talk about some things next class that influence this market a little bit more, but at least at this point, we're starting to think about a monopoly is going to have a huge markup. These monopolistically competitive firms, they're still going to have a markup, but it's not going to be quite as large as a monopolist would have, right? That's because they don't have as much market power. Part of that comes from the fact that their demand curve is flatter, right? What's the markup of a perfectly competitive firm? In the long run, price is equal to marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So price is equal to marginal cost. The markup is 0. Right? All right. Any questions over anything here before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So I think we'll do that here there. Let me think if I want to do this something before we go. We'll come back to that later. Okay. So we're now gonna, actually, I'll give you guys, I think, a good summary table. I think this will be helpful as you study. So let's think about, if I'm looking at the quantity that a monopolist chooses, right? That should be less than the quantity of a monopolistically competitive market, right? So not firm, but the entire market. And then that's going to be less than the quantity that these perfectly competitive markets choose, okay? So we're kind of thinking about the monopolistic competitive market is somewhere in between the perfectly competitive and the monopoly market. Same kind of idea. If I have these prices, what price should be the highest? So who has the most market power? Monopolists. Monopolistically competitive have a little bit more market power than perfectly competitive. So kind of the prices work in the opposite direction. Right? So kind of thinking about moving this like continuum between perfectly competitive and a monopolist. As we move more towards a monopolist, more market power, we're going to see lower quantities, higher prices. Okay? This might be, I don't know, something that's helpful as we kind of talk through things. I'll also give you a refresher before we start talking about profits. It didn't matter what market we were talking about. How would you calculate profits? You're going to take what? The number of units that you sell and multiply that by the difference between what? We don't remember at all. This is not boding well for the final. Profits are the quantity I'm selling and the difference between price and, you guys got to do some studying, right? Price and average total cost. You need to have this equation burned in your memory going into that exam, okay? So it's the difference between price and average total cost. That's how much money essentially I'm making per unit times the number of units I'm selling. So we said, if price is above average total cost, what's going to be true about my profits? Well, quantities are always positive, or at the very worst, 0. So if price is above average total cost, this difference would be positive. So profits are positive. If price is below average total cost, my profits are going to be, well, this value would then be negative. Now, one thing a lot of you forgot to check, especially with perfectly competitive markets, is if this is the case, what's the next thing I actually need to check? Because maybe there's a different equation I actually need to use for profits if I do what? Profits are negative. My next decision is, do I shut down or stay open? We said we would shut down if what? Price is what relative to my average variable cost? Seems some people say it below, right? And then we'll stay open if price is still above that average variable cost. Now, if I shut down, as just kind of a reminder, what does my profit equation become? If I shut down in the short run, my profits are just my negative whatever my fixed costs are. Okay? So I'm not really using this. I'll show you later on today. That's actually kind of hidden in this equation. But if we shut down, my profits are simply negative whatever my fixed costs are. Okay? All right. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So we're reusing, like, shouldn't be anything new. This is everything that we did before, right? How we calculated profits for both perfectly competitive and monopoly markets. So what is this going to look like? So if we've got this demand curve, we've got a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, okay? What we're now going to introduce, well, what do we need to calculate profits? We don't just need to identify the profit maximizing quantity price. We need to know what our costs, right? So I've now got my average total cost curve in here. So here I would have a depiction of profits that are what? So if I look at my profit maximizing quantity, that's where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. If I go up to the demand curve and set the price, my price is going to be above average total. So my profit should be positive, right? Price is above average total cost. I've got positive profits. What if, so let's say there's positive profits. And we'll think of this scenario where like, maybe there was 10 firms before splitting demand. They were all earning positive profits. So what do other people want to do? Get involved in that industry. Well, now if I have 20 firms, market demand might be exactly the same. It's now just being split amongst 20 firms instead of 10. So each firm's demand curve is going to be lower. If that's the case, what's the profit maximizing quantity now? Set the price going up to the demand curve. Now my price is below average total cost. So this area here would represent my profits. But if price is below average total, my profits are now negative. Right? Once again, it should look very similar to what we were doing with kind of perfectly competitive and monopoly markets, kind of just mashed together. Okay. Is this looking familiar? Any questions on this? I know I'm going through this a little bit quick, but I want to save time for things I think are a little trickier. Okay. So we already kind of went through these scenarios, but if we do have negative profits, we got to figure out, do we stay open or do we shut down? Okay, that was kind of our next decision. There we were comparing price to average variable cost, which we'll look at here in a second. Right? So let's say I had something like this. Okay. Now, these are kind of just our typical cost structure. We've got average total, average variable costs. Right? I've also got my marginal cost. So just to kind of rehash some things. So what's happening here when my marginal costs are decreasing? I have gains from specialization. Eventually, diminishing returns take over. Why is there a difference? So I've got here in the title, this is the short run. Why do I know this is the short run? There's a difference between my average total cost and my average variable. What is that difference? So it's not my fixed cost. The difference between the averages would be my average fixed cost, right? So in the short run, we still have these fixed costs. So if we're looking at the averages, though, the difference is going to be the average fixed cost. And we'll use this here in a second, okay? So let's say this monopoly competitive firm, profit maximizing quantity, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They go up to the demand curve, and they figure out this is the price that we can get away with setting. So notice, even in a scenario where we're going to eventually talk about we have negative profits, we still have a markup. The price is still going to be set above marginal cost. Okay? Now, at this profit maximizing quantity, oh, give me 1 second. I'm on call for something, so I have to get this out. I apologize. So, at this price, right, is that below my average total cost? Sorry, at this quantity, is my price below average total cost? Yes, right? So profits are going to be negative if I stay open, right? So if I stay open, I'm going to have negative profits here. So I'll do a little bit of a foreshadowing. I think I've got a slide for this, but I'll build it out. I think add some things that might be helpful. So should I stay open here? No, why not? My price is below average variable. So we can kind of prove to ourselves, why is this not where profits are kind of maximized, or said differently, losses aren't minimized? So let's go back to our profit equation and think about, revisit this. If I stay open and price is below average total cost, This will be my profits, but profits are negative, right? So this would be whatever my profits are. What if I shut down? Well, it's a little bit tricky here, but we know that it's just going to be negative fixed costs. I can actually kind of rearrange this a little bit to think about how could I find what those fixed costs are, right? So if I stay open, I'm just going to rewrite this as my average variable plus my average fixed. So I could now rewrite this as price minus average variable minus quantity times average fixed. So if I kind of shut down and don't operate, the only costs I'm going to pay are my fixed cost. Okay. If I stay open, if price is above average variable, well, then what's happening to my profits? They must be getting higher, right? Or it's a lower loss. What's another way we could find these fixed costs? Well, if I've got quantity times my average fixed cost, the difference between average total and average variable is my average fixed. So I didn't typically do this when we were looking through these models earlier, but I can give you a visual where you can actually calculate from the graph. And I won't actually make you do that on the exam. I would give you like values, like numbers to put with average total and average variable. But I can kind of give you a nice visual to go along with it, and it might help some of you. Okay? So here, I'm going to add a box. I'm going to change it to be blue. Well, let's make it green. Why not? So notice, if I shut down, what would represent my fixed costs? Well, we said that would be the quantity I'm selling times the difference between my average total and average variable, because that difference would represent my average fixed cost. How do I turn an average into a total? I just multiply it by the quantity. So here, this green box, if I stay open, here are my negative profits, right? Just the quantity I'm selling times that difference between price and average total cost. If I shut down, here would represent just my negative fixed costs. Which of those is a smaller area? The green box, which is just shutting down, only paying my fixed costs. So my losses, even though it's a smaller box, that's good because in this scenario, these are losses, right? So what if instead I had a scenario like this, right? So identify the profit maximizing quantity or marginal cost or marginal revenue. What if my demand curve set the price? Price is below average total cost. The profits are. Everyone in unison says negative, right? If they're negative, what's the next thing I need to check? Is that price above or below my average variable cost? It is here, so I know I should do what? Stay open or shut down? Stay open. So if I stay open, what are my profits? The difference between the price and average total cost, that's the height of this rectangle, times the quantity I'm selling, that would be the width. So that equation I showed you for profits, really just the area of these rectangles. Okay? So here's my losses, right? Price is still below average total, so negative profits, if I stay open. Here, what would be my losses if I shut down? So same kind of idea. It would be just my negative fixed cost. What would represent my fixed cost? Well, if I could find the average fixed cost, multiply it by quantity, that would be my total fixed cost. So at this quantity, how would I find my average fixed cost? Well, that would just be the difference between my average total and my average variable at that quantity. So in this scenario, we said the decision should be, I stay open and these are my losses. If I did shut down, what would my losses be? Much larger. So you can kind of prove this to yourself with numbers or like kind of with, I mean, really all a graph is, there's numbers behind this. So that's really all we're doing is a visual representation of numbers. But here, if price is ever above average variable cost, your losses are actually smaller if you stay open. before, if price was below average variable cost, our losses were actually larger if we stayed open than if we just shut down. Okay. So just kind of giving you a different visual to kind of go along with this rule that we've already talked about. Right. And here I kind of had a separate slide where I kind of made the comparison. I just thought it'd be kind of nice to kind of build those out, just throw those boxes, and I think show you why it's those boxes. I think makes a little more sense. But here's basically a slide that kind of does a very similar thing. One second here. All right. So where are we at in time? Oh, we have plenty of time. Hold on. Did I forget to do something, or am I just talking very excitedly today? Oh, I know what I want to do, but I haven't done yet here. So, well, we'll take a break here and we'll do this. So this should be on the main home page now. I'll give you guys about 4 or 5 minutes to kind of work through these. And then I'll kind of review the last one with you. So there's only 2 questions. I'll kind of have you guys do the first one on your own. And then I'll talk you through the second one. Okay. So the first one, I'm just asking you to identify monopolistically competitive firms' profit maximizing price or optimal price and quantity. We're then going to talk about how do we calculate what their profits are. Okay. So I'll give you guys, like I said, 4 or 5 minutes, kind of work on these. We'll review question 2 together and then kind of make sure we get it submitted by before 10:25 after we've talked about this. Okay. All right. Talk to people around you, kind of work on this for the next 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll come together and talk about it. All right, there we go. So let's think about a scenario where so I'm going to have my demand curve for these monopolistically competitive firms. I've got my marginal revenue, and I've got my marginal costs. Okay. Now let's say we start out in a scenario. Let me make sure, which one did I start with in the slides so that we can kind of go back. Okay. So let's say I've got an average total cost curve that looks something like this. Okay. So let's say this is the current setup. We would identify that profit maximizing, sorry, this is MC, profit maximizing quantity, go up to the demand curve, and this would be the monopolistically competitive firm's profit maximizing price. Everybody with me on that? Now, notice what's true about price relative to average total cost here. So if I'm thinking about the average total cost in this first scenario, price is less than. So here, in the long run, what goes to zero? What type of costs? So I've got variable and fixed costs. In the long run, what goes to zero? In the long run, I can change everything. So the only costs that I have are variable costs. Once again, if we don't know this, this is a problem for the final, right? In the long run, fixed costs go to zero. So my average total cost would be the same as what? My average variable costs. So if price is below average total, in the long run, it would be below average variable. So what should the firm do? Price is below average variable cost, so I should shut down. Now, if I shut down, think about this world where maybe I'm going from, say, let's say there was like 100 units demanded, and we currently had 4 firms. Each one's selling 25 units, but they have negative profits. What are some of those firms going to do? We said if there's negative profits in the long run, they're going to enter the market. I was getting such good engagement. What's happening on this side? Right? If I've got negative profits, price is below average variable cost, firms are going to exit. As they exit, if now overall demand is 100 units, I've only got 2 firms, each one's going to sell 50 units apiece. What's happened to the overall portion of the demand curve each firm faces? It has went up. Fewer firms, I'm going to get a larger portion of the overall demand curve. So think about here. I'm going to try to get this. Oops. So the monopolistically competitive firm now has a larger portion of the overall demand curve. Now when they choose the profit maximizing quantity, well, not surprisingly, there's fewer firms. Overall demand for the product is still the same. Each firm is going to sell more units than they were before. And they continue to get a larger and larger portion of the overall demand curve until, notice what's true here. My price is exactly equal to my average total cost. So if price of the monopolistically competitive firm is the same as their average total cost in the second scenario, profits are going to be equal to what? 0. Okay. Before, when price was below average total, we said profits started out as negative. So it's the same kind of concept as a perfectly competitive market. If there are negative profits in the long run, firms start to exit. What did that do in a perfectly competitive market? So if firms exited, the overall supply went down. That did what to the price? Pushed it up. Here it works slightly differently, right? As firms exit, it's not that the overall supply curve shifts, it's that each firm's portion of the demand curve shifts, but it's still going to push that price up until we get to that point where profits are exactly equal to 0. So it's kind of working through a different mechanism. It's still working through firm exit, right? But instead of like lowering the equilibrium price, it's raising the overall portion of demand that each firm faces. But the end implications are we still end up with these long run profits of zero. Okay? Any questions on that? Is that kind of making sense here, hopefully? So I've got a different depiction of this. So I think I have kind of the long run outcome. It's very similar to a perfectly competitive market. We end up with price equal to average total cost and profits are zero. Now, whether or not that's when profits started out as negative, firms exit, the demand each firm faces goes up until we end up with profits of zero. Same thing happens if we have positive profits, the price is above average total cost. What are firms going to do? They're going to enter that market. Now, overall market demand is being split up amongst more firms. So each firm's demand curve is going to be a little bit lower. As their demand curve is a little bit lower, it's going to push that price down until we end up with profits being equal to zero. So it doesn't matter if profits start out as positive. More firms will enter. Each firm's demand curve shifts down, pushing us to these lower prices until profits are equal to zero. Or like I had drawn out on the dot cam, if we start out with negative profits, more firms will exit, increasing demand, raising that price until we get to that long run outcome where profits are equal to zero. Okay. So it doesn't matter which scenario we start out in, kind of like a perfectly competitive market, we'll end up with long run profits being equal to zero. Okay. Any questions on that before we get moving? So let me make sure. What do I have here? Yeah, I'll draw this out for you when we're ready to the next class. Or we have plenty of time. So what I want to say here, the real key difference between this and a perfectly competitive market, the beginning and the end are the same. If profits are negative, firms will exit, and ultimately price is equal to average total cost, or profits are zero in the long run. Same kind of thing. If we have positive profits, positive profits, firms will then enter, we end up with long run profit of zero. The only difference is when firms were entering and exiting the perfectly competitive market, that was shifting our market supply curve and then changing the equilibrium price. Now, what is that equilibrium price? For each firm, it's the demand curve. So it was shifting that demand curve up or down, right? Raising or lowering the price. That's what this is doing too. It's just that it's not the equilibrium price, it's that each firm is facing a larger portion of the overall demand curve, which is still going to cause the same effects on price, right? When we see firms enter, that was pushing the price down. Well, here as firms enter, demand is going to decrease for each firm, pushing the price down. As that price gets lower and lower, that continues until we get profits equal to zero. In a perfectly competitive market, if we had negative profits, we said firms would exit, right? That's going to decrease our supply curve, pushing the price up until prices are high enough to where profits are zero. Same sort of thing here. If profits start out as negative, firms will exit, but instead of changing this equilibrium price, each firm is going to face a larger portion of the overall demand curve, which still has the same impact as the perfectly competitive market. When those firms exit, what's happening when the demand increases for the firm? The price they charge is going to go up until these profits, long run profits, are equal to zero. So what does the long run depiction look like for these monopolistically competitive firms? This is where it looks similar to a monopolist, but different in the long run. So we've got my demand curve here, and now I'm going to have, let's see, so I've got my marginal costs. I want, what do I want here? Trying to draw this to scale. So here's my average total cost. Well, I missed it a little bit, but here's my marginal revenue, right? So this is my monopolistically competitive firms' demand curve and marginal revenue. So they're going to set that equilibrium quantity, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. In the long run, the price they then set will be equal to average total costs. Give me 1 second. All right. So if price is equal to average total cost, my profits here are going to be equal to 0. Okay. If this was a perfectly competitive market, we said, what point are they going to get to? Right? Well, in the long run, where does the marginal cost curve hit the average total cost curve? At its, someone just said it, minimum point, right? So in the long run, this perfectly competitive price we said was the same as that minimum point. So the perfectly competitive profits were 0, but the price was at that lowest possible per unit cost. For a monopolistically competitive market, I guess maybe here I should kind of use some subscripts, but profits are still 0 and price is equal to average total cost, but are we at that minimum point? No. In fact, here for the monopolistically competitive firm, we know the price is going to be above that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So why do we care about this? Well, if I'm at this monopolistically competitive point, notice, what does this look similar to? The difference between marginal cost and demand from all these units we're not producing? It's pretty similar to deadweight loss, right? So here, we're going to have another term that we'll talk about next class, which is we know the perfectly competitive market gets to this point. We're at the minimum point of the average total cost curve. The monopolistically competitive market will not be there. So we're going to call this difference in quantity excess capacity, right? So basically, our monopolistically competitive markets are not operating efficiently, right? They have per unit costs that are higher than what a perfectly competitive market would have. So if I have higher per unit costs, is that going to be a better or a worse thing for society? For society, we want to be operating where our per unit costs are at their lowest point. So it's going to be a bad thing, which is why I said you can kind of think about we're going to have some deadweight loss created. Okay. So monopolistic competitive markets, even though the long run outcome, we said because of firm entry and exit will be that profits are equal to 0. It's not quite the perfectly competitive point, right? Because we're not going to be at that minimum point of our average total cost curve. So because we're not at that minimum point of the average total cost curve, we've got some excess, what we call excess capacity. You could be producing more units and lowering those per unit costs, and that's going to generate some deadweight loss. So monopolistic competitive markets will not be as efficient as perfectly competitive markets. Still have long run profits of 0, but once they're 0, there's no incentive for firms to enter and exit. We're stuck there, and we're stuck in a position where we have some deadweight loss. Okay. Any questions on this? So this is kind of a depiction of our long run outcome from monopolistic competitive market, and then kind of thinking about its comparison to where that perfectly competitive market would be. Are you all right with that? Okay, so look for a post on Canvas about my updated office hours being changed from Wednesday to Friday this week. I'll get module 13 reading synced up, change that first quiz question. Other than that, if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, enjoy the nice weather, and I will see you guys on Thursday.